The afternoon sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of the Silver Creek diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor where Margaret had worked for nearly 30 years, and her hands, though weathered by time and countless hours of carrying, heavy trays still moved with practiced grace as she refilled coffee cups and cleared tables, with the same care she had shown since the day she first put on that pale blue uniform. She had raised 3 children on the tips from this place, and though her husband Thomas had passed 5 years ago, the diner felt like home in a way that her empty house sometimes did not, and the regular customers knew her story just as she knew theirs. And there was comfort in that kind of knowing. It was a Thursday afternoon when the 3 young men walked in, and Margaret noticed them immediately, not because they were particularly loud, but because there was something in the way they carried themselves that made her think of boys who had never been told no, and the one in the middle wore a shirt with a designer logo she did not recognize, and his watch caught the light in a way that spoke of money. The kind of money that did not need to announce itself, except that it always did. She approached their booth with her usual warm smile, the same one that had greeted farmers and families and truckers and teachers for 3 decades. And she said what she always said about being glad they chose the Silver Creek and asking what she could get started for them. The young man in the middle barely looked up from his phone, and his friends seemed to find something amusing about her presence, though Margaret could not say what. And when she asked again, patient as always, he rattled off an order without meeting her eyes, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who had confused service with servitude. Margaret wrote it down carefully, her handwriting still neat, despite the arthritis that was beginning to settle into her knuckles, and she brought them water and silverware wrapped in paper napkins, and went to put in their order with Eddie the cook, who had been there almost as long as she had. The bikers had come in about 20 minutes earlier, and they sat at the counter like they did most Thursdays after their ride through the valley. And these were not the kind of bikers that people wrote worried letters to the newspaper about, but rather men and women in their 50s and 60s who had found freedom on 2 wheels after their children had grown and their careers had stabilized. Frank was among them, a man with silver hair pulled back in a ponytail, and eyes that crinkled deeply when he smiled, and he had lost his wife to cancer 2 years ago, and found that the open road helped with the grief in ways that sitting still never could. And beside him was Rita, who had retired from teaching high school English, and discovered that she liked the rumble of a Harley better than she had ever liked faculty meetings. They were talking quietly among themselves about the route they might take next week, when Margaret brought out the food for the 3 young men, and Frank happened to glance over just as she set down the plates with care, explaining what each dish was, though no one at that table seemed to be listening. What happened next occurred so quickly that for a moment Frank thought he had imagined it. But the young man in the middle said something about his burger being wrong, though, from where Frank sat. It looked exactly like what burgers looked like in this place and had looked like for decades. And when Margaret apologized and reached for the plate to check, the young man made a sound of disgust and spit directly at her feet. The diner went quiet, in that terrible way that spaces go quiet when something unthinkable has happened, and Margaret stood very still, her face flushing red, not with anger, but with a humiliation so profound that Frank felt it in his own chest like a physical weight. The young man's friends laughed nervous braying sounds that tried to turn cruelty into comedy, and Margaret bent down slowly to wipe the floor with a napkin from her apron, and Frank saw her hands shaking, and something in him that had been a father and a husband and a man who believed in basic human decency simply could not abide what he had witnessed. He stood up from the counter, and his friends, sensing the shift in him, stood too, and they walked over to that booth, not with aggression, but with the quiet certainty of people who had lived long enough to know what mattered. And Frank stood at the edge of the table and waited until the young man finally looked up from his phone. Frank did not raise his voice because he had learned long ago that volume was not where power lived, and he said that he had noticed what just happened, and that Margaret had been serving people in this diner with kindness and dignity since before this young man was born, and that perhaps he did not understand what it meant to treat another human being with respect, but that he was about to learn. The young man's bravado faltered, but only slightly, and he said something about it being none of Frank's business, and about how he could do what he wanted, and that if the service was bad, he had every right to complain. Rita stepped forward, then her voice still carrying that teacher quality that could quiet a rowdy classroom without effort, and she said that there was a difference between complaining and cruelty, and that what he had done was the latter, and that his mother would be ashamed if she knew, though perhaps she already knew, and perhaps that was part of the problem. The other bikers formed a loose semicircle, not threatening but present, and there was something about their stillness that was more powerful than any aggression could have been, and these were people who had raised families and lost loved ones and survived hardships that had taught them the value of kindness. Margaret still stood there, napkin in hand, and Frank turned to her and asked if she was all right, and she nodded, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and he asked her what the meal cost, and she told him. And he pulled out his wallet and counted out bills, enough to cover the meal and a tip that was twice what the food cost, and he handed it to her. Then he turned back to the young man and said that he and his friends were going to leave now, and that they were not welcome back, and that if Margaret ever saw them in here again, she should call him. And he pulled out one of his business cards, the ones from his consulting firm where he had worked for 30 years before retiring, and he set it on the table. The young man looked at the card and then at Frank, and something in his expression shifted as he recognized the name of the company and realized that this was not just some old biker, but someone who still had connections and influence, and his bravado crumbled entirely. His friends were already sliding out of the booth, eager to leave, and the young man threw some money on the table. Too much money, the kind of amount that was meant to be an insult in its excessiveness. And they left quickly, the bell above the door chiming their exit. The diner remained quiet for another moment, and then Eddie came out from the kitchen, and he walked over to Margaret and put his arm around her shoulders and said that she did not deserve that, and she nodded and wiped her eyes and said she was fine, though everyone knew she was not Frank. And the other bikers went back to their seats at the counter, and Margaret came over after a few minutes, and she thanked them in a voice that was thick with emotion, and Frank said there was nothing to thank them for, and that what they did was simply what decent people do. Rita ordered a piece of pie cherry, which was Margaret's specialty, and soon others in the diner did the same until Margaret was busy again, her hands moving through familiar motions, and the routine of work helped to steady her. As the bikers prepared to leave, Frank noticed that Margaret had taped his business card to the cash register, and when he raised an eyebrow, she smiled, a real smile this time, and said she liked having it there as a reminder that there were still good people in the world. He paid for everyone's meals at the counter over their protests and left a tip that made Margaret's eyes go wide. And as they walked out into the parking lot where their motorcycles sat gleaming in the late afternoon sun, Rita said that she was proud of all of them. They mounted their bikes and started the engines, and the sound rumbled through the parking lot, powerful and free. And as they pulled out onto the highway, Frank thought about his wife and how she always said that the measure of a person was how they treated those who could do nothing for them. Margaret watched them go from the window, and she thought about her own children, grown now with families of their own, and she hoped that she had taught them to stand up for others the way these strangers had stood up for her. That evening, when she got home to her small house with its neat garden and the photos of Thomas on the mantel, she called her daughter Sarah and told her what had happened, and Sarah was quiet for a long time before saying that she wished she could have been there, but that she was glad someone was. Margaret said that she had been scared for a moment, not of losing her job, but of losing her dignity, and that the young man's cruelty had made her feel small in a way she had not felt in years, but that Frank and his friends had given her back something she did not know she had lost. The next Thursday, the bikers came back, as they always did, and Margaret had saved them their usual seats at the counter. And when Frank sat down, she set a cup of coffee in front of him without asking, because she knew how he took it. And he smiled and thanked her. Rita mentioned that they were planning a longer ride next month, maybe up to the mountains, and Margaret said that sounded wonderful, and that she hoped the weather would be good, and they talked about routes and scenery and the sea.